Yes, we did. We met with the deputy mayor of Kyiv because the mayor himself was in Davos.
It's been over 5 years now. We've sent so many different connections to check on him. We've heard so many different rumors. We've had so many different scammers try to scam us.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with a bit of good news. After years of trying, citizens of Washington, D.C. have gotten the city to rename the block on which the Saudi embassy sits as Jamal Khashoggi Way. Jamal Khashoggi, of course, was the Washington Post reporter who was murdered, according to U.S. intelligence, on the direct orders of Mohammed bin Salman, the ruling Saudi prince. In theory, any letter sent to the Saudi embassy will have to be addressed to the Saudi embassy, Jamal Khashoggi Way. A little dig. Of course, the big news is that President Biden will be traveling to Saudi Arabia to meet up with that very same prince. If you recall, Biden during the campaign said he'd make Saudi Arabia a pariah. Of course, he's done no such thing, approving big weapons sales to that regime, and now going to Saudi Arabia to ask them to pump more oil. It's kind of a shame when you're a slave to fossil fuel. All kinds of unpleasant things happen. Face the facts, reporters don't mean much to U.S. politicians. Palestinian-American reporter Shireen Abu Akleh was shot dead by Israelis in mid-May. 29 days ago, 57 members of Congress asked for an FBI investigation of her killing, but Biden hasn't given any of them the courtesy of an answer. More about this killing at the website justiceforshireen.webador.com. A new work of art by Molly Crabapple about Shireen Abu Akleh. And a bitter take on the Barely Satire website. It reads, "It's been weeks since an Israeli soldier killed Shireen Abu Akleh, so I'm traveling to give comfort to the Israeli government." An interesting article in Haaretz, and for once it's not behind a paywall. It's written by a former Israeli legislator about two Palestinian Christian villages, Biram and Ikrit, up north by the Lebanese border. The people of those towns were told to leave temporarily in 1948. Temporarily never ended. So in 1951, the people there went to court, and they won. The Israeli High Court of Justice ruled that the residents should be returned to their homes. In anything like a democracy, that would have been the end of it. But the Israeli military just said no. And to this day, none of these people have been allowed to go home. Nor have they been given any other land as compensation. That's just the way it is. In apartheid Israel, the military can sometimes overrule the Supreme Court. We link to the article here in our headlines at thestruggle.org. 2. We link to the article here in our headlines section at thestruggle.org. Now an interview with Barbara Wien, who is back from an emergency religious visit to Ukraine by a high-level interfaith delegation.
I'll be speaking to Barbara Wien, who has just returned from a trip to Ukraine as part of an interfaith emergency delegation. Barbara is a professor at American University and works at establishing nonviolent programs as a response to war. She'll be speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stanley. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Could I start with what might have been the most emotionally striking part of your visit to Ukraine? Could you describe that to us?
Yes, and excuse me if I become emotional. Our first visit was Babin Yar, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Kyiv, Ukraine, where 33,000 Jews and others were systematically mowed down, gunned down, and dumped into a ravine by the Nazis during World War II. We started our first press conference there, and the Vatican had a representative with us, and we were almost a 20-person delegation made up of imams from throughout Europe, Spain, Italy, Poland. We also had numerous rabbis with us on the trip and bishops. And I can give you the details of all of these noble interfaith leaders and archbishops and others and representatives from the Vatican. The delegation itself, the caliber of these world-class theologians was just stellar. And I felt so honored to be in their company. So we prayed together at Babin Yar. We went on a privatized tour there. We saw the massacre site and the ravine where 33,000 Jews were dumped. And it was particularly personal for me because my father fled the Holocaust in Poland and through the kindness of strangers was saved and escaped thanks to the efforts of a young U.S. Foreign Service officer. And my father fled with his mother and sister via the Trans-Siberian Railroad through the USSR, China, ended up in Hong Kong, and took a steamship to Seattle in 1939. But all of the rest of our relatives were wiped out in the Holocaust. We lost everyone. Babin Yar is the most amazing sight. People have got to go. The Ukrainians have done so much to honor the dead, and I don't know if there's time for me to explain what they've done.
Yes, please do.
Well, after the war was over, the Soviets were highly insensitive to what had happened there to the Jewish population, basically just dumped the bodies indiscriminately. There were no markings. They paved over many of the areas where Jews had been buried, amusement parks and various facilities. But when the Ukrainians gained independence from the USSR 30 years ago, they began to resurrect the memory of these wonderful Ukrainian people, and they honored them by reburying them with headstones, marking the graves of the victims of the Nazi Holocaust at that point. And they have created a giant wooden structure that looks like a closed book. And then through a series of pulleys, it opens to become the most remarkable synagogue with hand-painted frescoes all on the inside. I'll send you pictures of those for your viewing audience. And there they honor the war dead right above the ravine where the Jews were dumped. And they've also created graveyards and pathways that light up at night saying the names of those who perished. Many, many things at Babin Yar to honor the dead, and not just Jews, but others who perished at the hands of the Nazis. So they've really done a lot to upgrade and improve Babin Yar over the years. It is just a remarkable sight, and so very valuable for people to learn what had happened and to honor those who died.
And this is in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine?
Right on. Yes, that's in Kyiv. Yes, it's pronounced Kyiv or Kiev in the United States.
Now let's go back to the beginning, really. When did you go to Ukraine, and why?
We were invited by the mayor of Kyiv and the top religious leaders in Ukraine to honor the peace tradition of the world's religions, all the world's religions, the golden rule, treat unto others as you wish to be treated yourself, and the peace traditions of all the world's great religions. And those of us who had heard about the call in the United States attempted to begin networking. And I want to give a huge shout out to Pax Christi, which is a Catholic social justice network, and Sojourners, headquartered in Washington, but with representatives all over the United States. They put out a fabulous magazine. Many of you who may have recognized Jim Wallace over the years, huge social justice advocate. Our representative was Rose Berger, who is a brilliant theologian and scholar and journalist. They began networking in the United States, inviting us, and through happenstance and serendipity, they interacted and networked with a wonderful Polish organization, Patient, a European association. And we began building the delegation at the request of the Ukrainians. We were dispatched our US representatives on the 22nd of May, arriving in Warsaw, where we met our counterparts from throughout Europe and Poland. And we then journeyed by 15 hours on bus over the Polish border to Kyiv, where we were greeted so warmly by Ukrainians with grace and dignity, those who had been raped and bombed and brutalized. And they welcomed us and met with us, and we began to give press conferences and prayer services.
So you went directly to Kyiv, and,
Yes.
and just about 2 weeks ago, I mean, something like that. It's very recent. So you toured around Kyiv and you saw some damage there, I assume?
Yes, we did. We met with the deputy mayor of Kyiv because the mayor himself was in Davos at the World Economic Forum. I imagine, trying to get infrastructure investments for the future. But we met with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish religious leaders throughout our course of time in Kiev to learn their reactions to the present situation and to learn what they saw and witnessed. We went into bombed out churches with bullet holes in the walls where people had worshiped. They also hid. They hid in the basement of the churches while Russian soldiers patrolled above in an area called Irpin, IRPIN, on the outskirts of Kyiv. We visited Ukrainian Greek Catholic churches. We visited Russian Orthodox churches. We met with the top imams from both the Tatar Muslim tradition in Ukraine, who have been repeatedly displaced by the Soviet Union and now Russia in recent decades and over the generations. We also met with Arab Muslim faith traditions. They have both in Ukraine. And that's the big takeaway I want you to understand, and I want your viewing audience to understand, that Ukraine is a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy. They've been struggling with this for 30 years to establish themselves. And you have to remember, at one point they had Hitler on one side and Stalin on the other of their country, and they have been besieged many times. And so they, are not without their flaws. They're not without their discrimination. Of course, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture of Ukraine, but they have made many attempts to be a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy at great personal risk. And, in 2004, they had a nonviolent revolution called the Orange Revolution against Putin's and Russia's puppets. At that point, it was Yeltsin's puppets. No, it was Putin's puppets. And then again in 2014, they had the Maidan Revolution. Again, trying to purge corruption, trying to purge undemocratically elected leaders, and they succeeded. And so we met with many of these faith communities all around Kyiv, on the outskirts of Kyiv, and we met with civil society leaders as well, women's movements, peace movements, and mediation specialists who are trying to resolve conflicts in the home, in the community, because as we know, during times of war, interpersonal violence also increases, and things like domestic violence. So they're very honest about it, that they're trying to, through prayer and pastoral accompaniment and interfaith efforts and mediation and peace building, peacemaking, trying to address violence at all levels of society. We also delivered humanitarian aid. That's not our particular specialty. There's many large-scale macro networks that are doing that much better than much better than our delegation. But that's just a small flavor of all the different kinds of people we met with. And particularly meaningful for me was to meet with all the top rabbis in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They were funny and warm and gracious and joked with us and just very wise.
More of the interview in a future program. You can see it all now if you go to our site, thestruggle.org. Some of you took part in the call to change your Facebook profile to that of arrested Syrian American Dr. Majd KamAlmaz. Now we'll give the talk that his daughter Maryam gave at the Promoting Enduring Peace Forum. Dr. KamAlmaz, detained in Syria since 2017, is a psychotherapist specializing in trauma, particularly those who suffer it from war. His daughter Maryam is following in her father's footsteps and is founder of the nonprofit Be in Peace.
A little bit about my father. My father moved to the United States when he was in elementary school. He came here with his family. He grew up mostly in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's where also he went to school and graduated from college with his psychology degree. At that time, he also started working for an organization called Stepping Stone in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they're used to treat troubled youth that had gone through, abuse, domestic abuse, drug abuse, different types of things. They would call him in the middle of the night. He'd jump up and run out to go see these youth because that was his passion, something he felt very drawn to do, is to help others. Continuing in his education, he felt that he was more needed to treat those that had suffered the worst of the worst. And that's where he started going out to different war zones or countries that had experienced horrific traumatic incidences like the tsunami in Indonesia, the hurricane in New Orleans, the war in Kosovo and in Bosnia. He would go set up his institution and start going from house to house, knocking on doors, seeing who needed help, who needed treatment, bring the people back to his office, treat them. And so it became something very dear and close to him, that he would always travel and try to help as many people as he could that had suffered the worst situations possible. So of course, when the war in Syria happened, that was, he felt the need to be there for the people as well. And that's why he went to Lebanon. He established his center in Lebanon, International Institute for, International Institute for Psychosocial Development. He used a program called Heart Math, and that was a technique where it was based upon the heart. He taught the refugees how to control their breathing in order to relieve the stress and anxiety that they had gone through. He had also treated so many young children for bedwetting at night. They had a 90% success rate. It was so successful that Heart Math awarded him Humanitarian of the Year award because of his work with the refugees. There was great turnaround with the refugees. They were able to get their lives back together just through the techniques that he was using to treat them. A few months after he received that Humanitarian of the Year award, he decided to go into Syria and see what the situation is in Syria and be there for if anybody needed any sort of help, any sort of therapy, as well as to check on family members. He went into Syria from Lebanon on February 14, 2017. He slept at a family member's house that night. The next morning, he went out on his first trip, and he was stopped at a checkpoint and disappeared. And we don't know anything about him. We haven't heard his voice or been able to contact him ever since that day. It's been over 5 years now. We've sent so many different connections to check on him. We've heard so many different rumors. We've had so many different scammers try to scam us. They've sent us different fake pictures of him that looked like he had aged. His teeth had fallen out. He was very pale, only for us to then discover these were edited Photoshop pictures that weren't accurate. There was a lot that had offered to get him released for a certain amount of money, which we were ready to do, only to find out that it was all a scam as well. We haven't been able to get to him, and it's only made it more difficult. So for the first 2 years of his detainment, we decided to stay private in hopes that the Syrian government would not harm him. We thought we'd protect him by staying private, and there was a higher chance of him being released. However, after 2 years of no success, we decided that it's time for us to reach out to the US government and have them try to do some sort of negotiation for his release. And that's when we decided to go public. We did reach out to different media outlets, to Fox News, CNN, CBS, all of the different news outlets trying to get the word out about his detainment. And luckily, President Trump did take interest in his case. Eventually, at that time, President Trump did send 2 diplomats from the White House, one of them being Roger Carstens, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, and Kash Patel, a White House official, down to Syria. And that's when they sat with one of the Syrian government's officials, Ali Mamlouk, and they mentioned the American detainees. They didn't provide us with any information. There was no sort of progress out of this meeting. We didn't learn anything new. The Syrian government denied saying anything to help us learn if our father's still alive or not, if he's still well or not, anything about him. We're still in the same hole that we were before they left. Nothing has actually progressed from that meeting. Up until this day, we still don't know anything about him. So my father is a grandfather to 13 children who ask about him all the time. He's an only son to my grandmother, who also calls me almost every other day. And she says, Miriam, do you think I'll ever hear his voice again? Tell her, I don't know. It's hard to tell. I don't know. Every day is moving by and he's not getting any younger. He's 64 years old now. He's a diabetic. He's had strokes in the past. Although I do know that when he did leave, he was in good health. It's been 5 years, and we don't know how his situation is. And it's difficult for us because we're here in the United States and we really don't have anyone in Syria to ask about him besides us trying to find different sort of connections of different people that could go and ask about him. And that hasn't been successful. We're just word of mouth, nothing with actual proof. So till this day, we are in the same boat as Naila's sister and entire family of children and her husband that have disappeared. It's a black hole where families disappear and nobody knows anything about them. The Syrian government will not acknowledge them, will not say, yes, we have this person, will not say what their condition is or how they're living. So it's a very difficult situation to be in.
From Democracy Now! News about Alaa Abd El-Fattah, the British-Egyptian activist who's been in al-Sisi's jails for years. Alaa is now on a very serious hunger strike.
And in news from Egypt, the imprisoned Egyptian activist Alaa Abd El-Fattah is approaching his 11th week on hunger strike to protest the harsh conditions he's held under at Cairo's Tora prison. Earlier this week, one of Alaa's sisters, Sana Saif, described her brother's dire situation.
My brother is slowly dying in his prison cell, but he wants to live. He misses life, he misses his job, he misses his son and us. On Sunday, my sister visited him in prison, Mona. When she saw him, she was shocked. She hasn't been able to eat since. The effect was such that she decided to start a hunger strike herself in solidarity. She told me I have to use my body as a portal to show people what's happening to Alaa.
His sister, Ms. Saif, spoke with Sky News recently in Britain and said she is confused as to why she and other members of the family have yet to meet with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss in their campaign to get him freed. Remember, he's a joint British-Egyptian citizen. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.